The Royal Opera House gleamed under the soft glow of 1,000 candles on that fateful night in April 1885. Lady Eve Aldridge sat in her family's box, her emerald silk gown catching the light as she shifted uncomfortably beneath the weight of society's expectations. At 23, she was already considered dangerously close to spinsterhood by London's unforgiving standards, a fact her aunt reminded her of daily. "Sit straighter, Eve," Lady Henrietta Aldridge whispered sharply. "The Viscount of Berkshire is watching from across the gallery." Eve resisted the urge to roll her eyes. "The Viscount is watching everyone, Aunt. His gaze wanders more than his investments." "Heavens," her aunt hissed, "such impertinence will not secure your future." The orchestra began tuning their instruments as the elite of London society settled into their seats. Eve found herself studying the opera-goers rather than preparing for the performance. Her education at a progressive school in Switzerland, a scandal her late father had insisted upon, had left her ill-suited for the suffocating expectations of Victorian high society. A sudden hush fell over the crowd. Eve followed the collective gaze to the grand box opposite theirs, where a striking figure had appeared. Even from across the theatre, his presence commanded attention. "The Duke of Thornbury," her cousin Catherine whispered, leaning forward with undisguised fascination. "They say he's been abroad for years. Something about a scandal involving his late wife." Eve studied him with detached curiosity. Tall and imposing, the Duke stood rather than sat, surveying the crowd as one might inspect a property for purchase. His evening attire was impeccable, his posture rigid. Though distance obscured his features, something about his bearing suggested a man accustomed to power and its exercise without question. "He's looking for a new duchess," Lady Henrietta informed them with barely contained excitement. "Every eligible family in London has received his calling card." "How fortunate we've been overlooked," Eve murmured, just loud enough for her aunt to hear. The performance began, Verdi's notes soaring through the opulent space, but Eve found her attention repeatedly drawn to the Duke's box. He seemed as disinterested in the opera as she was, his gaze wandering across the audience. During the interval, the corridors filled with the aristocracy's practiced chatter. Eve escaped her aunt's vigilance and slipped toward a less crowded passage that led to a small balcony overlooking the Thames. The cool night air was a welcome relief from the stifling atmosphere inside. "You seem to find London society as tedious as I do, Lady Aldridge." The deep voice startled her. Turning, she found herself face to face with the Duke of Thornbury. Up close, he was even more imposing, tall and broad-shouldered, with sharp features carved from what seemed like marble. His eyes, a piercing steel blue, studied her with unsettling intensity. "Your Grace," she said, offering a curtsy that was just shallow enough to be noticed. "I wasn't aware we were acquainted." A ghost of amusement flickered across his face. "We aren't. But your reputation precedes you, as does yours, Your Grace." The words escaped before prudence could intervene. Instead of offense, something like interest sparked in his eyes. "And what reputation is that?" "That you're particular about your company," she replied carefully. "Yet here you are, seeking conversation with a woman known for her unconventional opinions. Perhaps I find conventional opinions tiresome." He moved closer, his scent of sandalwood and leather invading her space. "What do you make of the performance, Lady Aldridge?" "I find the audience more dramatic than the stage, Your Grace." The corner of his mouth twitched. "A keen observation. And which players have caught your attention tonight?" "Those who believe a title grants them wisdom rather than merely land and privilege." The words hung between them, bold and dangerous. His eyes narrowed slightly. "You speak quite freely for someone in your position." "And what position is that, precisely?" "An unmarried lady of good family but diminishing prospects." His assessment was cold, calculated. Eve felt heat rise to her cheeks. "I believe the interval is ending, Your Grace. I should return to my aunt before she sends a search party." As she moved to pass him, he stepped into her path, not touching her, but close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "You misunderstand me, Lady Aldridge. I don't disapprove of your candor. On the contrary, I find it refreshing." His voice had dropped lower, almost intimate. "Then you're in the minority, Your Grace." "I've never aspired to be among the majority." The warning bell sounded, announcing the end of the interval. Eve felt trapped between the wall and the Duke, though he had not moved to touch her. "If you'll excuse me," she said, her voice steadier than her pulse. "Of course." He stepped aside, but as she passed, he added, "Lady Aldridge, a word of caution. There are those in society who would see your spirit broken rather than celebrated. Be careful whom you challenge." She paused, turning back to face him. "Including you, Your Grace." For the first time, a genuine smile crossed his face, transforming his severe features into something unexpectedly handsome. "Especially me." Eve returned to her box with her heart racing. Throughout the remainder of the performance, she could feel his gaze from across the theatre. When she finally dared to look directly at his box, their eyes met across the expanse of crimson velvet and crystal chandeliers. The intensity of his stare sent a shiver down her spine. It wasn't fear that made her pulse quicken, but something far more dangerous. Later, as their carriage rolled through London's foggy streets, her aunt prattled on about potential suitors, but Eve's thoughts remained with the enigmatic Duke and his warning. Or was it a challenge? "You're unusually quiet," Catherine observed as they approached their Mayfair home. "I'm merely tired," Eve replied, though sleep was the furthest thing from her mind. "Did something happen during the interval?" her cousin pressed. Eve thought of the Duke's penetrating gaze, his unexpected words. "Nothing of consequence," she lied, unaware that their brief encounter had set in motion events that would irrevocably change her life. In his own carriage across London, the Duke of Thornbury, known to few by his given name of Richard Blackwood, contemplated the emerald-eyed Lady Aldridge. Her defiance had awakened something he'd thought long buried. Curiosity, yes, but also desire. Not merely for her beauty, though she possessed that in abundance, but for her mind, sharp and unafraid. "Bridgerton residence tomorrow, sir?" his valet inquired as they approached his Belgravia mansion. "No," the Duke replied, his decision made. "We'll call on the Aldridge household instead." "Very good, sir." As London slept beneath a blanket of fog, two souls remained awake, one contemplating a challenge issued, the other a challenge accepted. Neither could have predicted how their lives would soon entangle, for better or worse. The Aldridge household erupted into chaos the following afternoon, when the Duke of Thornbury's card was delivered. Lady Henrietta nearly swooned, while Catherine peppered their butler with questions about the Duke's demeanour. "Did he say why he's calling?" Eve asked, the only one maintaining her composure, despite her racing heart. "No, my lady," Simmons replied. "Only that he would be honoured to speak with Lady Aldridge, specifically you, my lady." Lady Henrietta clutched her handkerchief. "Goodness gracious, the Duke here. The drawing-room must be prepared at once. Catherine, fetch your best gown. You too, Eve. We must make a favourable impression." "I am already dressed appropriately for receiving visitors, Aunt," Eve replied calmly, though internally she was anything but calm. She wore a high-necked day dress in deep blue that complemented her dark chestnut hair, which was neatly arranged in an elegant chignon. "But this is the Duke of Thornbury, not some country squire," her aunt protested. "And I am Lady Eve Aldridge, not a debutante at her first ball," Eve countered firmly. Before her aunt could respond, the sound of carriage wheels on gravel announced the Duke's arrival. The household staff rushed to their positions, while Lady Henrietta patted her hair frantically, and Catherine pinched her cheeks for colour. Eve took a deep breath and positioned herself by the window, determined to appear unaffected by his visit, though her heart hammered against her ribs. The Duke was announced moments later, his tall figure filling the doorway. In daylight, he was even more striking, his dark hair showing hints of auburn in the afternoon sun, his features sharp but harmonious. He bowed to Lady Henrietta, greeted Catherine with practiced charm, and then turned to Eve. "Lady Aldridge," he said, his voice carrying a warmth absent in his other greetings. "Thank you for receiving me." "Your Grace," she replied with a proper curtsy this time. "We're honoured by your visit." Lady Henrietta launched into a stream of pleasantries, offering tea and inquiring after the Duke's health. He responded with impeccable politeness, but his eyes repeatedly returned to Eve. "I wonder, Lady Henrietta," he said when she paused for breath, "if I might speak with Lady Eve about a matter of mutual interest." "Of course, Your Grace." Lady Henrietta practically glowed with anticipation. "Catherine and I were just about to inspect the conservatory, weren't we, dear?" Catherine, clearly disappointed to be dismissed, nevertheless followed her mother from the room, leaving Eve alone with the Duke. Save for Bridget, Eve's lady's companion, who sat discreetly in the corner, her presence the only thing preserving propriety. The moment the door closed, the Duke's demeanour subtly shifted. The practiced charm gave way to something more genuine, though no less intense. "You seem surprised by my call, Lady Aldridge." "I confess I am," she admitted. "Our conversation last night hardly seemed to warrant a formal visit." He moved to the window where she stood, careful to maintain a proper distance. "On the contrary, I found it the most stimulating conversation I've had since returning to England." "You must have spoken to very few people then, Your Grace." A smile tugged at his lips. "Quality over quantity, Lady Aldridge." She studied him, trying to discern his purpose. "What is this matter of mutual interest you mentioned to my aunt?" "Literature." He gestured to the book half hidden on the side table. "Wordsworth? An interesting choice." Eve glanced at the volume of poetry she'd been reading earlier. "You're familiar with his works?" "The world is too much with us. Late and soon, getting and spending, we lay waste our powers," he quoted softly. "Little we see in nature that is ours. We have given our hearts away, a sordid boon," she finished, surprised. His eyes held approval. "You see, Lady Aldridge? Mutual interests indeed. I wouldn't have thought a duke would find time for poetry between managing estates and attending social obligations. There's much about me you wouldn't expect." He moved closer, dropping his voice. "Just as I suspect there's much about you that defies expectation." From her corner, Bridget coughed discreetly, reminding them of her presence. The Duke acknowledged her with a nod before returning his attention to Eve. "I've come to invite you and your family to a small gathering at my estate this weekend," he said, his voice returning to its public timbre. "Oakenhurst is only an hour's journey from London. The spring gardens are quite remarkable." Eve raised an eyebrow. "A gathering? You've only just returned to society, Your Grace." "All the more reason to reacquaint myself with England's finest families," he replied smoothly, "including the Aldridges." She sensed there was more to this invitation than social niceties. "And if I decline?" His eyes gleamed with challenge. "Then I would be disappointed, but I would respect your decision. However," he added, lowering his voice again, "I believe you would find the library at Oakenhurst particularly to your taste. My grandfather was an avid collector of first editions, including several rare volumes of female authors society preferred to ignore. It was a calculated move, appealing to her intellectual curiosity, and they both knew it." "A tempting offer," she admitted. "Then you'll come?" Eve considered her options. Refusing would be the prudent choice. Something about the Duke unsettled her in ways both frightening and exhilarating. Yet the promise of rare books, combined with her own curiosity about this enigmatic man, proved too compelling. "I shall have to consult with my aunt," she said finally. "Of course." He reached into his coat and produced an envelope. The formal invitation, for Lady Henrietta's peace of mind. As she took it, their fingers brushed, the briefest of contacts, yet it sent a jolt through her that she struggled to hide. From his sudden stillness, she suspected he had felt it too. "Until the weekend, Lady Aldridge." He bowed, his eyes never leaving hers. After he departed, Lady Henrietta and Catherine rushed back into the room, bombarding her with questions. Eve handed over the invitation, her mind elsewhere. Why had the Duke singled her out? Was it merely her defiance that intrigued him, or something more? That night, as her lady's maid prepared her for bed, Bridget spoke up from where she was turning down the covers. "Be careful, my lady," she said softly. "Men like the Duke, they're not accustomed to hearing no." Eve met her companion's concerned gaze in the mirror. "Do you think his interest is improper, Bridget?" The older woman chose her words carefully. "I think his interest is genuine, which may be more dangerous still. His eyes followed you like a hawk watches a dove." "I'm hardly a dove," Eve replied with a small smile. "No, my lady, you're not," Bridget agreed. "Perhaps that's what draws him. But remember, hawks are predators by nature, no matter how magnificent they appear in flight." Later, lying in bed with moonlight streaming through the curtains, Eve recalled the Duke's intense gaze across the opera house, the way his voice had lowered when they spoke alone, the electricity when their fingers touched. Danger, yes, but also something thrilling that called to the part of her that had always felt constrained by society's narrow expectations. Across London, in his study at Thornbury House, the Duke examined a leather-bound journal containing carefully researched information about Lady Eve Aldridge, her education in Switzerland, her father's progressive politics before his death, her small but significant inheritance, held in trust until her marriage or 25th birthday, her reputation for intelligent conversation and disregard for certain social conventions. "She's not like the others," his secretary, Mr. Oliver Harrington, observed from where he stood by the fireplace. "No," the Duke agreed, closing the journal. "She's not. Is that wise, Richard? After what happened with the Duchess?" The Duke's expression hardened. "Lady Aldridge is nothing like Charlotte. Still, society will talk, especially given her outspoken nature." "Let them talk," the Duke replied, pouring himself a brandy. "I find I care less for society's opinion with each passing year." Oliver studied his longtime friend and employer. "What is it you want from her?" The Duke stared into the amber liquid as if it held the answer. "I'm not entirely sure," he admitted, "but I intend to find out." The weekend approached with the inevitability of fate. Lady Henrietta had accepted the invitation with almost indecent haste, and now the Aldridge women found themselves in a carriage bound for Oakenhurst, the Duke's country estate. As they passed through the iron gates and down a long drive lined with ancient oaks, Eve caught her first glimpse of the mansion, a grand Palladian structure of golden stone, its windows glinting in the spring sunshine. It was beautiful, yet somehow forbidding. "Remember your manners," Lady Henrietta instructed for the dozenth time. "This could be the opportunity of a lifetime, Eve." Eve merely nodded, her attention caught by a solitary figure standing at the top of the entrance steps. Even at this distance, she recognized the Duke's commanding presence. As their carriage pulled to a stop, he descended to greet them personally, an honor that had Lady Henrietta practically glowing with pride. He assisted each lady from the carriage, his hand lingering slightly longer when it clasped Eve's. "Welcome to Oakenhurst, Lady Aldridge," he said, his eyes conveying a message beyond his formal words. "I trust your journey was comfortable?" "Quite, Your Grace," she replied. "Your estate is impressive. You've seen nothing yet," he promised, offering his arm to escort her up the steps. "Allow me to show you the gardens first. I believe they'll be to your liking." Lady Henrietta and Catherine followed, escorted by the Duke's secretary, Mr. Harrington. As they rounded the side of the house, Eve gasped despite herself. The gardens were magnificent, a harmonious blend of formal Italian design and the more natural English style, with fountains and statuary artfully placed among flower beds, bursting with spring blooms. "This is beautiful," she admitted freely. "My grandmother's passion," the Duke explained, his voice softening with rare sentiment. "She believed gardens should balance structure with wildness, much like life itself." They strolled along a gravel path, gradually outdistancing the others. When they reached a small pavilion overlooking a lake, the Duke slowed. "I hoped we might speak privately," he said, glancing back to ensure they weren't overheard. "There's something I wish to discuss with you, Lady Aldridge." Eve felt a flutter of apprehension mixed with curiosity. "Is it proper for us to be alone, Your Grace?" "We're hardly alone," he replied, nodding toward the house, where several guests could be seen on the terrace. "Merely out of earshot." She raised an eyebrow, which some might argue is the more dangerous state. "Do you feel in danger from me?" he asked, studying her face intently. "Should I?" His expression grew serious. "No. Whatever else I may be, I am a gentleman. But I find the conventions that govern our society often prevent honest conversation. And you wish for honest conversation with me. Why?" He gestured for her to sit on a stone bench, maintaining a proper distance as he joined her. "Because you intrigue me, Lady Aldridge. You speak your mind in a society that demands women be decorative and agreeable. You've educated yourself beyond what most men deem appropriate. You challenge me. And you enjoy being challenged?" "I enjoy authenticity," he corrected, "something rarely found in our circles." Eve studied him, trying to reconcile this thoughtful man with the cold, imposing figure of the Duke's public persona. "What is it you wish to discuss that requires such privacy?" He seemed to choose his words carefully. "I find myself in a position where I must remarry. My family name requires an heir, and society expects a duke to have a duchess." Eve's heart inexplicably sank. "I see. You're seeking advice on potential candidates? I'm afraid I'm poorly qualified to—" "No," he interrupted firmly. "I'm not asking for matchmaking services. I'm informing you that I've been evaluating potential wives, and after our meeting at the opera, I find myself drawn to you." She stared at him, speechless for perhaps the first time in her adult life. "I'm not proposing marriage," he clarified, misreading her silence. "Not yet. I believe such decisions should be based on more than a brief acquaintance. But I am proposing an understanding." "An understanding," she repeated slowly. "I would like your permission to court you, Lady Aldridge, properly, with your aunt's blessing, to determine if we might suit." Eve found her voice at last. "Forgive me, Your Grace, but this is unexpected. We hardly know each other." "Hence the courtship," he replied with a hint of amusement. "I'm not asking for your hand today. I'm asking for the chance to discover if you might one day be willing to give it." She stood, needing space to think. "Why me? There are dozens of eligible young ladies in London with larger dowries, better connections, and more compliant natures." He rose as well, his height forcing her to tilt her head to maintain eye contact. "Perhaps I've had my fill of compliance. Perhaps I want a wife who will speak truth to me, even when it's uncomfortable. Perhaps—" his voice dropped lower. "Perhaps I simply find you impossible to forget after our encounter at the opera." The intensity in his eyes made her breath catch. This was madness. She barely knew him, and his reputation was shadowed by rumors she didn't fully understand. Yet something about him called to her in ways no other man ever had. "I need time to consider," she said finally. "Of course," he inclined his head. "But I should warn you, I'm not a patient man by nature, Lady Aldridge. When I decide I want something, I pursue it with determination. And is that what I am to you? Something to be pursued and acquired, like a prized horse or a rare book?" Instead of taking offense, he smiled, a genuine smile that transformed his austere features. "No, Lady Aldridge, you are neither object nor possession. You are a woman of uncommon intelligence and spirit, and I find myself wanting to know if those qualities might complement my own nature." He offered his arm once more. "Shall we rejoin the others before your aunt sends out a search party?" As they walked back toward the house, Eve was acutely aware of his presence beside her, the subtle scent of his cologne, the warmth of his arm beneath her gloved hand, the way other guests watched their progress with undisguised interest. "You realize you've just ensured I'll be the subject of gossip throughout the weekend," she murmured. "Would you prefer I pretend indifference?" he asked. "I would prefer understanding your true intentions," she replied honestly. He stopped walking, turning to face her fully. "My intentions are precisely as I've stated them. I wish to court you with the eventual aim of marriage, should we find ourselves compatible. I'm not a man who plays games, Lady Aldridge. All of society is a game, Your Grace. You know that as well as I. Then perhaps it's time to change the rules." His gaze held hers, unwavering and sincere. "I'll await your answer, but not indefinitely." With that, he escorted her back to the terrace, where Lady Henrietta was already speculating with the other guests about the apparent interest the Duke was showing in her niece. The die had been cast. Whatever Eve decided, she knew her life had irrevocably changed the moment the Duke of Thornbury had claimed her with his gaze across the opera house. For better or worse, remained to be seen. The weekend at Oakenhurst unfolded like a carefully orchestrated play. The Duke was attentive to all his guests, but found ways to single Eve out, requesting her opinion during dinner conversations, arranging for her to partner him during an impromptu musical evening, ensuring she was seated near him at every opportunity. By Sunday morning, the gossip among the guests had reached fever pitch. Lady Henrietta was beside herself with anticipation, while Catherine vacillated between envy and excitement at the prospect of becoming cousin to a duchess. Eve found sanctuary in the promised library, a magnificent two-story room lined with thousands of volumes. She had slipped away after breakfast, seeking solitude to clear her thoughts. The Duke had given her until their departure that afternoon to consider his proposal of courtship. She ran her fingers along the spines of leather-bound books, inhaling the comforting scent of paper and binding glue. Here, at least, she could think clearly, away from the Duke's magnetic presence and her aunt's transparent scheming. "I thought I might find you here." She turned to find Mr. Harrington, the Duke's secretary, standing by the library entrance. Unlike his employer, Oliver Harrington had a gentle manner, scholarly and reserved, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed spectacles. "Mr. Harrington," she acknowledged with a nod. "I was just admiring His Grace's collection." "His grandfather's collection," he corrected, approaching a nearby shelf. The current duke has added to it, of course, but the foundation was laid by the old duke, a remarkable man with progressive ideas for his time. Like his grandson? She asked, unable to keep the skepticism from her voice. Oliver studied her thoughtfully. His grace is complex. But yes, in many ways he takes after his grandfather rather than his father. You speak as though you knew them both. I grew up at Oakenhurst, he explained. My father was the previous Duke's secretary before me. I've known Richard, his grace, since we were boys. Eve seized the opportunity to gain insight. Then you must know him well. A small smile crossed Oliver's face. Better than most, though I wouldn't presume to say I know all his thoughts. She hesitated, then decided on directness. The rumors about his first marriage, Oliver's expression grew guarded, are largely exaggerated, as rumors tend to be. But something did happen? Something that drove him from England? He sighed, removing his spectacles to polish them with a handkerchief, a delaying tactic, she suspected. It's not my place to discuss his grace's personal affairs. I will say only that he suffered a great deal, and that he deserved better than the treatment he received from society. Was he cruel to her? Eve asked, voicing her greatest fear. Oliver's head snapped up, his expression shocked. Good heavens, no. Richard would never... He caught himself reverting to formality. His grace is many things, Lady Aldridge, but cruel is not among them. He is demanding, yes, exacting in his expectations, but never cruel. Before she could press further, the library door opened again, revealing the subject of their conversation. The Duke paused, taking in the scene before him. I see you found the library's greatest treasure, Oliver, he said, his tone light, but his eyes watchful. Lady Aldridge was admiring your collection, Your Grace, Oliver replied smoothly. I was just explaining its history. And now you're needed elsewhere, I believe, the Duke said pointedly. Oliver bowed to them both. So of course, Your Grace, Lady Aldridge. As the door closed behind him, the Duke approached Eve. Finding everything to your satisfaction? The library is magnificent, she admitted. I could spend weeks here and not read half of what interests me. Then you must return, he said simply. Regardless of your answer to my proposal. She met his gaze directly. I was asking Mr. Harrington about your first marriage. If she expected anger, she was disappointed. Instead, his expression showed something like respect for her boldness. And did he satisfy your curiosity? No, he's quite loyal to you. As he should be. The Duke moved to a nearby window, looking out over the gardens. What is it you wish to know, Lady Aldridge? Ask me directly. She joined him at the window, keeping a proper distance. Why did you leave England after your wife's death? And why return now, seeking another marriage? He was silent for so long she thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was controlled, but she sensed the effort it cost him. Charlotte, the late Duchess, was not what she appeared to be when we married. I was young, barely 25, and she was beautiful, accomplished, and seemingly gentle-natured. Within months of our marriage, I discovered she had destructive tendencies. In what way? His jaw tightened. She gambled, not socially, as many ladies do, but compulsively. She accumulated debts I knew nothing about until creditors began appearing at our door. When I attempted to address the issue, she became unpredictable, volatile. Was she unwell? Eve asked softly. In her mind, yes, though it wasn't recognized as such then. Her family had hidden her episodes of melancholy and rage, presenting her as the perfect aristocratic daughter. His expression darkened. They knew what they were doing. They needed her married to wealth to save themselves from her father's poor investments. What happened to her? He turned to face her fully. She took her own life, here at Oakenhurst in the East Wing. The servants found her in her bath. I was in London at the time, addressing another of her gambling debts. Eve's hand went to her throat. How terrible, indeed. But what followed was worse. Her family, to hide the truth of her suicide, and to deflect from their deception before our marriage, implied I had driven her to despair with cruelty. They whispered that I had married her for her family name and then neglected her, that I had paramours in London while she wasted away in the country. None of which was true. I was faithful to her until the end, despite everything. I tried to help her, brought doctors from as far as Vienna. Nothing worked. He ran a hand through his hair in a rare gesture of vulnerability. After her death, I couldn't bear the whispers, the sidelong glances. I left for my estates in America, then travelled. For 5 years I've stayed away from England. And now you've returned to find another wife, Eve said, trying to keep judgment from her voice. Why? Because I'm the last of my line, he replied simply. Because despite everything I believe in family, in legacy, in building something that outlasts oneself. His eyes held hers. And because I believe it's possible to find a true partnership in marriage, despite my first experience. With me? She asked, still incredulous that he had singled her out. You intrigue me, Lady Aldridge. You have spirit, intelligence, and honesty, qualities I've come to value above beauty or dowry or connections. When our eyes met across the opera house, I felt... He paused, seeming to search for the right words. I felt recognized, seen for who I am rather than the title I bear. The vulnerability in his admission touched her. Still, caution held her back. You speak of partnership, Your Grace, but marriage for women is rarely equal. A husband owns his wife's property, controls her movements, dictates her choices. Is that how you see marriage? It's how the law sees marriage, she corrected. No matter a husband's intentions, the power lies entirely with him. He considered this. And if I were to offer guarantees, legal protections for your independence and property, you would do that? I would consider it, he said carefully, for the right woman. Eve studied him, trying to reconcile the rumors she'd heard with the man before her, complicated, demanding, but seemingly honest about his past and his expectations. I need to think, she said finally. Of course. He moved toward the door. We depart in 2 hours. I'll await your answer then. Alone again among the books, Eve paced the library's length. The Duke's revelations had shifted her understanding of him, but questions remained. Was she prepared for the scrutiny that would come with being courted by him? Could she trust that his interest in her was genuine and lasting? And most importantly, could she maintain her sense of self while tied to one of the most powerful men in England? When the time came to depart, the Duke handed her into the carriage last, using the moment to murmur, Your answer, Lady Aldridge. She met his gaze steadily. Yes, Your Grace. You may court me, but I make no promises beyond that. Something like triumph flashed in his eyes. I ask for no promises yet, only opportunity. As the carriage pulled away, Eve watched the Duke standing on the steps of Oakenhurst, a commanding figure against the grand facade. She had just altered the course of her life with a single word. Whether toward happiness or heartbreak remained to be seen. The following weeks transformed Lady Eve Aldridge from a moderately notable society figure into the subject of London's most avid speculation. The Duke of Thornbury's courtship was conducted with the same precision and attention to detail that characterized everything he did. Flowers arrived daily at the Aldridge home. Invitations to exclusive events were extended. Carefully selected books appeared, each containing a pressed flower and a note in the Duke's strong hand, commenting on passages he thought might interest her. Lady Henrietta was beside herself with pride, while Catherine vacillated between jealousy and excitement at being adjacent to the season's most talked-about courtship. Bridget watched it all with quiet concern, saying little but observing much. He's very determined, she remarked one evening as she brushed Eve's hair before bed. Yes, Eve agreed, watching her reflection in the mirror. He approaches courtship as he might a military campaign. And does that trouble you, my lady? Eve considered the question. Not as much as perhaps it should. There's something reassuring about his certainty. And your own feelings? Bridget asked carefully. I find him fascinating, Eve admitted. Complex. Not always easy to understand, but never dull. When we're together, I feel... She trailed off, unsure how to articulate the mixture of challenge, excitement, and safety she felt in the Duke's presence. Alive, Bridget suggested softly. Eve's eyes met her companion's in the mirror. Yes, exactly that. The courtship progressed through London's spring season, their encounters always chaperoned, but somehow intimate nonetheless. The Duke had a talent for creating private moments in public spaces, a quiet conversation in a crowded ballroom, a shared observation during a musical performance, a brief touch of hands while examining a painting at an exhibition. At a garden party in early June, they found themselves momentarily separated from the other guests, hidden from view by a flowering arbor. The Duke's hand brushed against hers, a seemingly accidental touch that sent warmth spiraling through her. "You've been avoiding private conversation with me," he observed, his voice low. "I've been observing propriety," she corrected. "As have you, until this moment." His lips quirked. "6 weeks of proper courtship has nearly exhausted my patience, Lady Aldridge." The great Duke of Thornbury impatient. "I'm shocked," she teased, finding boldness in the secluded setting. "Only where you're concerned." His expression grew serious. "You've had time to observe me now, to form opinions beyond rumors and first impressions. I would hear them." Eve considered her words carefully. "I believe you are a man of principle, if not always conventional morality. You value honesty and dislike pretense. You're demanding of others, but most demanding of yourself." She paused. "And I believe you're still haunted by your first marriage, despite your determination to move forward." Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps, at her perception. "Quite the character study." "You asked for my observations," she reminded him. "So I did." He moved closer, still not touching her, but near enough that she could feel the heat of his body. "And what of your feelings beyond these clinical assessments?" Her heart quickened. "Those are more difficult to articulate." "Try," he urged softly. She took a steadying breath. "I find myself thinking of you when you're not present, anticipating our next meeting, replaying our conversations." The admission cost her something in pride, but honesty compelled her forward. "I'm drawn to you in ways I don't fully understand." His expression softened, vulnerability showing through his usual reserve. "I have thought of little else but you since that night at the opera. Your intelligence, your spirit, your beauty. They've captivated me entirely." Before she could respond, voices approached their secluded spot. The Duke stepped back smoothly, maintaining appearances, but his eyes held a promise of future conversation. Later that evening, as the Aldridge carriage returned them to Mayfair, Lady Henrietta could contain herself no longer. "The Duke barely left your side all afternoon," she observed, failing to hide her excitement. "Surely a proposal is imminent." "Aunt, please," Eve protested. "We've known each other barely 6 weeks." "6 weeks is an eternity for a man like the Duke," Catherine chimed in. "Everyone says he never does anything by halves. When he makes a decision, he acts." Eve gazed out the carriage window at the passing London streets, illuminated by the soft glow of gas lamps. Her cousin's words echoed her own thoughts. The Duke was not a man to court indefinitely without purpose. Soon she would face a choice that would determine the course of her future. That night, she dreamed of steel blue eyes and a voice that caressed her name like a physical touch. She woke breathless, her body warm with unfamiliar yearning. 2 days later, an unexpected visitor arrived at the Aldridge home. Eve was reading in the morning room when Simmons announced, "Mr. Oliver Harrington to see you, my lady." Surprised, Eve set aside her book. "Show him in, please." Oliver entered, looking uncharacteristically uncomfortable. "Lady Aldridge, forgive the intrusion." "Not at all, Mr. Harrington. Please, sit." She gestured to the chair opposite hers. "Is the Duke well?" "In health, yes," Oliver replied carefully. "In spirits." He hesitated. "That's actually why I'm here." Unofficially and without His Grace's knowledge. Eve straightened, concern growing. "What's happened?" Oliver leaned forward, lowering his voice though they were alone. "Yesterday was the anniversary of the late Duchess's death. Richard, His Grace, always struggles with this date. He tends to retreat into himself, become somewhat harsh in his dealings with others." "I see," Eve said slowly, "and you're telling me this because I've observed his regard for you is genuine, Lady Aldridge. More than that, I believe you've awakened something in him that I feared was permanently lost after Charlotte's death." Oliver's expression was earnest. "He may withdraw from you in the coming days. I didn't want you to misinterpret his behavior." "That's very thoughtful, Mr. Harrington, but—" "Please," he interrupted, uncharacteristically bold. "I've known Richard since we were boys. I've seen him at his best and his worst. What happened with Charlotte nearly destroyed him. Not just her death, but the scandal, the whispers, the isolation he faced afterward." His voice grew passionate. "He built walls around himself that no one has breached until you. If you care for him at all, don't let him retreat behind them again." Eve studied the secretary's anxious face. You care deeply for him. He is not merely my employer, but my oldest friend, Oliver acknowledged. And I believe you could bring him happiness if you chose to. Before she could respond, Simmons appeared at the doorway. A message from the Duke of Thornbury, my lady. Eve accepted the sealed note, breaking the wax emblem with steady fingers. Inside, a brief message. My carriage will call for you at 3 o'clock if convenient. I have matters of importance to discuss. T. No response is needed, Simmons, she said, folding the note closed. When the butler had departed, she turned back to Oliver. It seems the Duke wishes to see me this afternoon. Relief crossed his features. Good. That's unexpected, but good. He rose to leave. I should go before he learns I've been here. He wouldn't appreciate my interference. Mr. Harrington, she called as he reached the door. Thank you for your candor. He bowed slightly. I hope I haven't overstepped, my lady, but I believe some rules are worth breaking for the right cause. After he departed, Eve reread the Duke's note, noting the formal tone that contrasted with his recent, more personal communications. Oliver's warning echoed in her mind. What demons haunted the Duke on the anniversary of his wife's death, and was she prepared to face them alongside him? At precisely 3 o'clock, the Duke's carriage arrived. Lady Henrietta insisted on sending Bridget as chaperone, though she nearly vibrated with excitement at this unexpected development. Remember, a lady always appears composed no matter the circumstances, she instructed, as Eve donned her bonnet. If he proposes, accept with dignity, not excessive emotion. Aunt, please, Eve protested. We're merely going for a drive. A private drive requested with urgency, her aunt countered meaningfully. Be prepared, my dear. The Duke himself handed her into the carriage, his manner formal and his expression guarded. After acknowledging Bridget with a nod, he took the seat opposite them, instructing his driver, Hyde Park, Edward. They rode in silence for several minutes, the Duke's gaze fixed on the passing streets. Eve studied him surreptitiously, noting the tightness around his eyes, the slight clench of his jaw. There was tension in his posture that hadn't been present in their recent meetings. I trust you're well, Lady Aldridge, he finally said, his tone politely distant. Quite well, Your Grace, she replied, watching him carefully. And yourself? Well enough. His gaze finally met hers, but it was guarded. I appreciate your agreeing to this drive on short notice. Of course. Another silence fell, this one stretching uncomfortably. When they reached the relative privacy of Hyde Park, the Duke instructed the driver to proceed slowly along the less trafficked paths. Though other carriages and riders were visible in the distance, they had a measure of privacy, while still maintaining propriety with Bridget's presence. I owe you an explanation, the Duke said abruptly, for my absence these past 2 days. No explanation is necessary, Your Grace, Eve replied gently, though I admit I wondered if something had happened to change your regard. Something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps at her directness. No, my regard remains unchanged. He hesitated, then added more quietly, if anything, it deepens with each meeting. Her heart quickened at the admission. Then why the formality today? The distance. He glanced briefly at Bridget, who had diplomatically turned her attention to the scenery outside the carriage window, before answering in a lower voice. Yesterday was difficult for me. The anniversary of Charlotte's death always is. His hands tightened on his walking stick. I find myself revisiting decisions, questioning whether I could have prevented what happened. You feel responsible, she observed softly. I was her husband, he replied simply. Her protection was my duty, even from herself. He looked away. I failed in that duty. Eve considered her next words carefully. Mr. Harrington believes otherwise. The Duke's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing. Oliver spoke to you about this? He was concerned for you, she said, not wishing to cause trouble for the secretary. He cares deeply for your well-being. He oversteps, the Duke muttered, though without real anger. Perhaps, Eve acknowledged, but I appreciate understanding the context for your withdrawal. The Duke studied her for a long moment. Most women would have been offended by my sudden absence after weeks of devoted attention. They would demand apologies, reassurances. I'm not most women, she reminded him. A ghost of a smile touched his lips. No, you are not. His expression grew serious again. That's precisely why I've asked to see you today, Lady Aldridge. I find myself at a crossroads. Regarding? My intentions toward you. He leaned forward slightly. I began this courtship with clear purpose, to determine if we might suit as husband and wife. After these weeks in your company, I find my initial interest has grown into something far deeper than I anticipated. Eve's breath caught. Your Grace. Richard, he interrupted. When we're as private as circumstances allow, I would hear my name from your lips. The intimacy of the request sent a shiver through her. Richard, she said softly, testing the shape of it. What are you saying? His gaze held hers intently. I'm saying that yesterday, in the midst of remembering my greatest failure, I found myself thinking not of the past but of you, of a future that seemed impossible until I met you. He reached across the space between them, his gloved hand hovering near hers. I'm saying that I wish to ask you a question of great significance, but I find myself, for perhaps the first time in my adult life, uncertain of my reception. Bridget coughed discreetly, reminding them of her presence without looking their way. The Duke straightened, withdrawing his hand. Perhaps this conversation requires a more appropriate setting. He raised his voice slightly. I would like to call on you tomorrow, Lady Aldridge, to speak with your aunt about a matter of importance. Would 11 o'clock be convenient? Eve understood his meaning immediately. Yes, Your Grace. I believe that would be most convenient. The remainder of their drive passed with safer topics. A discussion of a new exhibition at the Royal Academy, commentary on the fashions they observed in the park, mild gossip about mutual acquaintances. Yet underneath the conventional conversation ran a current of anticipation that made Eve's heart race whenever their eyes met. When he returned her to the Aldridge home, the Duke handed her down from the carriage with proper decorum. Yet as her feet touched the pavement, he held her hand a moment longer than necessary, his fingers pressing something into her palm. Until tomorrow, he said, his voice carrying a promise. Inside her gloved hand, she found a small key with a ribbon tied around it. Only when she was alone in her bedroom did she examine it more closely, finding a tiny note attached to the ribbon. For the lock on your heart. The question remains whether you will use it. Eve pressed the key to her lips, understanding the symbolism. The Duke, Richard, was offering her access to his guarded heart, while acknowledging the choice remained hers. That night, sleep eluded her. She paced her bedroom, the key clutched in her hand, weighing the implications of the morning to come. Marriage to the Duke would elevate her to the highest ranks of society, grant her influence and security, and connect her to a man who increasingly occupied her thoughts and, if she were honest with herself, her heart. Yet questions lingered. Could she truly know a man after mere weeks of formal courtship? Would the passion he stirred in her sustain through years of marriage? And most significantly, could she maintain her identity and independence as the Duchess of Thornbury? As dawn broke over London, Eve made her decision. Whatever her answer would be, she would give it honestly, with full awareness of the path she was choosing. The Duke arrived at precisely 11 o'clock, dressed impeccably in a formal morning coat. Lady Henrietta received him in the drawing-room with barely contained excitement, while Catherine hovered nearby, eager to witness what she correctly anticipated would be a historic moment for the family. Eve entered last, composed in a day dress of deep blue that complemented her complexion. Their eyes met across the room, and for a moment it felt as though they were alone, the connection between them palpable despite the formal setting. "Your Grace," Lady Henrietta gushed. "What a pleasure to receive you this morning." "Lady Henrietta," he acknowledged with a bow. "Miss Aldridge." "Lady Eve." His gaze lingered on Eve, something like vulnerability showing briefly in his usually guarded expression. She offered a small smile of encouragement. "I've come on a matter of great importance," he said, addressing Lady Henrietta but glancing repeatedly at Eve. "Over these past weeks, I've had the privilege of becoming acquainted with your niece. I find her to be a woman of exceptional quality, intelligent, principled, and possessed of a rare spirit that I have come to admire deeply." Lady Henrietta beamed, while Catherine clasped her hands in anticipation. The Duke turned fully to Eve now. "Lady Aldridge, Eve, I believe we could build something extraordinary together, a partnership based on mutual respect and genuine affection. He moved closer, taking her hand in his. "I am asking for the honor of your hand in marriage, with your aunt's blessing." Though she had anticipated the moment, hearing the words spoken aloud made Eve's heart race. She looked into his eyes, searching for any doubt, any hesitation. She found only certainty and something softer, a vulnerability he showed to no one else. "Before I answer," she said softly, "I must know, will you allow me to remain myself? To maintain my opinions, my interests, my voice? Marriage often requires women to become shadows of their husbands." "I am not asking for a shadow," he replied earnestly. "I am asking for a companion, a partner. Your voice is precisely what drew me to you, Eve. I would never ask you to silence it." Lady Henrietta made a small sound of distress at this unconventional exchange, but Eve ignored her, focused entirely on the man before her. "And my independence, my property, will remain yours, secured legally before our marriage," he promised. "I've already instructed my solicitors to draw up the documents." She took a deep breath, searching her heart one final time. In his eyes she saw not the cold, imposing duke of public reputation, but the man she had come to know, complex, demanding, but also capable of great tenderness. "Then yes," she said clearly, "I will marry you, Richard." His face transformed with a smile of genuine joy, perhaps the first she had seen from him without reservation or guard. He brought her hand to his lips, the touch sending warmth through her entire body. "How you have made me the happiest of men," he said, his voice rough with emotion. Lady Henrietta burst into excited chatter about arrangements, seasons, and trousseau, while Catherine rushed to embrace her cousin. Yet Eve hardly heard them, her attention fixed on Richard's face, on the promise and challenge she saw there. Whatever the future held, she had chosen her path with open eyes and a full heart. The Duke had claimed her with his gaze across the opera house, but in the end she had claimed him in return. The engagement of the Duke of Thornbury to Lady Eve Aldridge dominated London society's attention throughout the summer of 1885. The wedding was set for September, a rapid timeline by aristocratic standards, but one that suited the Duke's decisive nature and Eve's practical temperament. Preparations consumed the Aldridge household. Lady Henrietta alternated between ecstatic planning and nervous fretting over every detail. Catherine assisted with endless fittings and correspondence, while privately lamenting that her own prospects paled in comparison to her cousin's magnificent match. Eve approached her impending nuptials with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. Richard called daily, their conversations growing more intimate as the formality of courtship gave way to the deeper connection of betrothal. Yet she couldn't help noticing that for all their increased closeness, parts of his life remained closed to her, particularly anything concerning the east wing of Oakenhurst, where his first wife had died. "Will we reside primarily in London or at Oakenhurst after the wedding?" she asked one afternoon as they strolled through the garden of Thornbury House, his London residence. Bridget followed at a discreet distance, providing the necessary chaperonage. "Both according to the season," Richard replied, "though Oakenhurst requires some preparation before it becomes our primary residence." "The East Wing," she said, watching his expression carefully. His face tightened almost imperceptibly. "Yes, it has remained closed since Charlotte's death. I've instructed the staff to begin renovations, new furnishings, new decorations. Nothing will remain as it was." "Is that necessary? It seems almost like trying to erase the past." "Not erase," he corrected, "but I won't have you living in the shadow of tragedy. Oakenhurst should be a place of new beginnings for us, not haunted by what came before." She touched his arm gently. "Richard, I'm not afraid of the past. I don't need to be protected from it." He covered her hand with his. "It's not merely for your protection, Eve. He hesitated, then admitted quietly, "I haven't entered that wing since the day they removed her body. I'm not certain I can." The vulnerability in his confession touched her deeply. "Then we'll face it together," she promised, "before the wedding. We'll walk through it together, and then decide what changes are needed." He studied her with a mixture of wonder and uncertainty. "Most women would demand the entire wing be demolished rather than live where such tragedy occurred. I'm not most women," he finished with the ghost of a smile. "I'm well aware, and increasingly grateful for it." After a moment's consideration, he nodded. "Very well. We'll visit Oakenhurst next week, together. The promise hung between them, both challenge and opportunity. Eve understood instinctively that confronting the physical space of his greatest pain was a crucial step in truly building their future. As the wedding approached, however, complications arose from an unexpected quarter. One evening in late August, Eve returned from a final fitting of her wedding gown to find a visitor waiting in the drawing room, a striking woman in her 40s, elegantly dressed but with a hardness in her eyes that contrasted with her polite smile. "Lady Aldridge," Simmons announced. "Lady Eleanor Blackwood to see you." Eve entered with cautious curiosity. The name Blackwood, Richard's family name, suggested a relation, though he had mentioned none. "Lady Eleanor," she acknowledged with a polite curtsy. "I don't believe we've been introduced." "No," the woman agreed, her voice cultured but cool. "My nephew has been remarkably silent regarding my existence." "Your nephew," Eve repeated, understanding dawning. "You're the Duke's aunt?" "His father's younger sister," Lady Eleanor confirmed. "The only remaining Blackwood besides Richard himself." She gestured to the chair opposite hers. "Please sit. I believe we have matters to discuss that concern you greatly." Eve sat, maintaining her composure despite the unexpected encounter. "The Duke hasn't mentioned you." "I'm not surprised. We've been estranged since Charlotte's death." Lady Eleanor's expression grew somber. "Which is precisely why I've come to see you, Lady Aldridge. I believe there are things you should know before you marry my nephew." Wariness crept through Eve. "With all due respect, Lady Eleanor, anything concerning my future husband should come from him directly. And if he has deliberately kept certain truths from you, truths that might affect your decision to bind yourself to him?" Lady Eleanor leaned forward, her voice dropping. "Did he tell you that Charlotte was with child when she died?" The revelation struck Eve like a physical blow. "No," she admitted softly. "He did not." "Did he tell you that they argued violently the day before her death, that servants heard him threaten to have her committed to an asylum if she didn't behave as befitted a duchess?" "I don't believe—" "Did he tell you," Lady Eleanor pressed on relentlessly, "that Charlotte wrote to me the week before she died, expressing fear for her safety and that of her unborn child?" Eve stood abruptly. "Lady Eleanor, I must ask you to stop. Whatever grievances exist between you and the Duke, I will not be used as an instrument in them." The older woman rose as well, her expression hardening. "You think me vindictive, motivated by some petty family squabble. I assure you, my only concern is preventing another tragedy." She reached into her reticule and withdrew a folded letter. "Charlotte's last letter to me. Read it, then decide whether my warnings merit consideration." Eve stared at the offered letter, conflict warring within her. "I cannot accept this," she said finally. "If there are questions to be asked about Charlotte's death, I will ask them of my fiancé directly." Lady Eleanor studied her with a mixture of frustration and reluctant respect. "You're either remarkably loyal or remarkably naive, Lady Aldridge. I hope for your sake it's the former." She returned the letter to her reticule. "Should you change your mind, I'm staying at Claridge's until the end of the week." After the unwelcome visitor departed, Eve sat alone in the drawing room, her thoughts in turmoil. Richard had spoken of Charlotte's mental instability, her gambling, the difficulties of their marriage, but he had never mentioned a pregnancy. Was it an omission of painful memory or something more deliberate? That evening, she sent a note to Thornbury House requesting Richard call on her the following morning on a matter of importance. She passed a restless night, torn between loyalty to the man she had agreed to marry and the unsettling questions raised by his estranged aunt. Richard arrived early, concern evident in his expression, as he was shown into the morning room where Eve waited alone, having asked her aunt and cousin to give them privacy, a scandalous request, but one Lady Henrietta reluctantly granted, given the imminence of the wedding. "Your note sounded urgent," he said, foregoing formal greetings. "Are you unwell?" "I'm quite well," she assured him. "But something has happened that I must discuss with you." She gestured for him to sit. "I received a visitor yesterday. Your aunt, Lady Eleanor Blackwood." The change in his demeanor was immediate and dramatic. His body tensed, his expression closing like a door slamming shut. "Eleanor came here? To my fiancé's home? Without my knowledge?" "She did," Eve confirmed. "She had concerns about our marriage. About you." She took a deep breath. "Richard, She told me that Charlotte was with child when she died. Is that true? The silence that followed seemed to stretch endlessly. Richard stood and moved to the window, his back to her, shoulders rigid with tension. When he finally spoke, his voice was controlled, but threaded with pain. Yes, he admitted. Charlotte was 4 months pregnant when she took her life. Why didn't you tell me? Eve asked softly. He turned back to face her, his expression haunted. Because it remains the greatest failure of my life, that I couldn't protect my wife or my unborn child from Charlotte's demons. His voice broke slightly. And because I feared how you would judge me for it. Judge you? She repeated. Richard, I would never... Eleanor believes I drove Charlotte to suicide, he interrupted. She believes I was a monstrous husband who cared nothing for my wife's well-being, who threatened her with asylum when she became inconvenient. His laugh was bitter. She conveniently forgets that Charlotte had already attempted to harm herself twice before that final day. That the asylum was recommended by physicians as the only way to keep her safe until the child was born. Eve rose and moved to him, taking his hands in hers. Tell me what truly happened, Richard. All of it. His fingers tightened around hers, as though drawing strength from the connection. Charlotte's condition worsened with the pregnancy. Her moods became more volatile, her gambling more desperate. The doctor believed she suffered from a condition of the mind that sometimes affects women in pregnancy, exacerbated by her existing fragility. He closed his eyes briefly. The night before she died, she had lost an enormous sum, money that was meant for the child's trust. When I confronted her, she became hysterical, threatening to harm herself. And you threatened to have her committed? Eve asked gently. I told her that if she couldn't control her impulses, I would have no choice but to follow the doctor's recommendation for confinement, for her safety and the child's. It wasn't a threat, Eve. It was desperation. His voice grew rough with emotion. The next day I went to London to speak with specialists about treatment options. When I returned, they had already found her. The pain in his voice was raw, unfeigned. Eve reached up to touch his face, gently turning it toward hers. I believe you, she said simply. Something in his expression shifted. Relief, gratitude, and a vulnerability he rarely showed. Eleanor never forgave me. She and Charlotte had been close, and in her grief, she needed someone to blame. I was the convenient target. She showed me a letter, Eve said. A final letter from Charlotte expressing fear. Charlotte's mind was not well, Eve. In her paranoia, she believed many things that weren't real. He caught her hands again. I have never raised a hand to a woman. I never would. Whatever my faults, and they are many, cruelty is not among them. She studied his face, the pain in his eyes, the sincerity in his expression. Whatever had happened with Charlotte, she believed in her heart that the man before her was not capable of driving his wife to suicide. Complicated, demanding, sometimes harsh in his judgments. Yes, but not cruel, not monstrous. I believe you, she repeated. But, Richard, there can be no more secrets between us. Not if we're to build the partnership you spoke of. He nodded slowly. No more secrets, he agreed. Which is why we should go to Oakenhurst tomorrow as planned. It's time to confront the past fully before we begin our future. The following day they travelled to Oakenhurst accompanied by Bridget and Oliver Harrington. Lady Henrietta had protested the impropriety of Eve visiting her fiancé's country estate before the wedding, but Richard had insisted it was necessary for practical planning of their future home. The familiar drive through the gates of Oakenhurst felt different now. The grand house held new significance as her future home, but also as the site of tragedy that still haunted the man she was to marry. As the carriage stopped before the entrance, Eve noted workmen on the east side of the mansion, beginning the renovations Richard had ordered. Are you certain about this? Richard asked quietly as he handed her down from the carriage. We can still postpone this visit until after the wedding. I'm certain, she replied firmly. We face this together now, so it doesn't stand between us in the future. The entrance hall of Oakenhurst welcomed them with marble floors and soaring ceilings. The housekeeper, Mrs. Porter, greeted them with formal respect, though Eve noted curiosity in the woman's eyes as she was introduced as the future Duchess. Tea will be served in the blue drawing-room in an hour, Your Grace, Mrs. Porter informed them. The east wing has been opened as requested, though the renovations have only just begun. Thank you, Mrs. Porter, Richard replied. "We won't require accompaniment." The housekeeper curtsied and withdrew, leaving them standing at the foot of the grand staircase. Bridget and Oliver remained in the entrance hall, providing the minimum propriety while allowing the couple some privacy for their difficult task. Richard offered his arm. "Ready?" Eve took it, feeling the tension in his muscles. "Together," she reminded him. They ascended the staircase and turned toward the east wing. Even before they passed through the connecting corridor, Eve sensed the difference in the atmosphere. Where the main house was lived in, maintained with care and attention, the east wing felt suspended in time, the air stale despite efforts to air it out, the furnishings covered in sheets, the wallpaper slightly faded where sunlight had touched it through closed curtains. Richard's steps slowed as they approached a set of double doors at the end of the corridor. His breathing had become shallow, his grip on her arm tightening unconsciously. "These were her rooms," he said, his voice unnaturally controlled. "The Duchess's suite." Eve placed her hand over his where it rested on her arm. "We can turn back if it's too difficult." He shook his head. "No, it needs to be done." With visible effort, he reached for the door handle and pushed it open. The suite beyond was spacious and elegant, even beneath dust covers and with curtains half drawn. A sitting room led to a bedchamber, and beyond that a dressing room and bathing chamber. It was there, in the white-tiled bathing room, that Richard finally stopped, his face pale. "This is where they found her," he said quietly. "The water still warm. Too late to save either of them." Eve squeezed his hand, offering silent support. In the austere bathroom with its large porcelain tub, she could almost feel the weight of what had happened there, the despair that had driven a troubled young woman to such a final act, the unborn child who never had a chance at life. "It wasn't your fault, Richard," she said softly. "You couldn't have known what she would do. Couldn't I?" His voice was harsh with self-recrimination. "I knew she was unstable. I knew she had threatened harm before. I shouldn't have left her alone." "You were seeking help for her," Eve reminded him. "Acting on medical advice. You couldn't have stayed by her side every moment." He turned to her, his expression raw with years of suppressed grief and guilt. "I failed them both, Eve. My wife, my child. What kind of husband, what kind of father does that make me?" In that moment, Eve understood the true purpose of this visit, not merely to exorcise ghosts or prepare for renovation, but for Richard to finally confront the guilt he had carried for 5 long years, to speak it aloud to someone who might offer absolution, or at least understanding. She stepped closer, taking both his hands in hers. "It makes you human, Richard. Fallible, like all of us. You did everything a husband could reasonably do for a wife suffering as Charlotte was." "Eleanor doesn't think so," he said bitterly. "Eleanor is grieving too, in her own way," Eve replied. "Grief makes us seek answers, assign blame, when sometimes there are no satisfying explanations." She reached up to touch his face, guiding his gaze to meet hers. "Charlotte's demons were not of your making, Richard. Her choices were her own, however influenced by her troubled mind." Something shifted in his expression. Not an immediate release of guilt, but perhaps the first crack in its foundation. "How do you see so clearly what has been clouded to me for years?" "Because I'm not trapped inside your pain," she said simply. "I see you as you are. A man who tried his best in an impossible situation and has punished himself far too long for failing to achieve the impossible." He drew her into his arms then, holding her as though she were a lifeline in a storm-tossed sea. They stood together in that room of tragedy, finding connection and comfort where there had been only pain and isolation. "We'll make this house live again," Eve promised softly, "not by erasing the past, but by building a future alongside it. Charlotte and your child will always be part of your story, Richard, but they needn't be its ending." He pulled back slightly to look at her, wonder in his eyes. "How did I find you, Eve Aldridge?" "You claimed me with a single gaze across the opera house," she reminded him with a gentle smile. "But I claimed you in return." They left the east wing hand in hand, the air somehow lighter between them, despite the heaviness of what they had confronted. The ghosts weren't exorcised, perhaps they never would be completely, but they had been acknowledged, brought into the light, rather than left to lurk in shadow. The 2 weeks before the wedding passed in a whirlwind of final preparations. Eve found herself caught in a flurry of fittings, social calls, and last-minute arrangements. Through it all, She sensed a subtle change in Richard, a softening, an openness that hadn't been there before their visit to the East Wing. The day before the wedding, a package arrived for Eve, a jewelry case bearing the Thornbury crest. Inside she found not the family diamonds she had expected, but a delicate necklace of sapphires and pearls, with a note in Richard's hand. Not a family heirloom, but the beginning of our own traditions. Something new, like the life we will build together. Yours, Richard. The gesture touched her deeply, his acknowledgement that their marriage would not be shadowed by the past, but would forge its own path. The wedding day dawned clear and bright, as though even the notoriously fickle English weather approved of the union. St. George's Church in Hanover Square was filled with London's elite, eager to witness the marriage of the enigmatic Duke of Thornbury to the spirited Lady Aldridge. In the small anteroom where Eve prepared with her attendants, Catherine adjusted the delicate veil of Brussels lace, while Bridget secured the final pins in her elaborate coiffure. "You look absolutely radiant," Catherine sighed, stepping back to admire her cousin. "The Duke won't be able to take his eyes off you." Eve studied her reflection in the mirror. Her wedding gown was a masterpiece of ivory silk and hand-embroidered flowers, its modest neckline adorned with the sapphire and pearl necklace Richard had given her. She touched it gently, drawing strength from the symbol of their new beginning. "Are you nervous?" Bridget asked softly, as she adjusted a wayward curl. "Strangely, no," Eve replied. "I feel certain." And it was true. Despite the whirlwind courtship, despite the shadows they had confronted together, she felt a profound certainty about the step she was taking. A gentle knock at the door revealed her uncle, Lord James Aldridge, who had travelled from his estate in Northumberland to give her away in her late father's stead. "It's time, my dear," he said, his eyes widening appreciatively at the sight of her. "By Jove, you're the image of your mother on her wedding day." Eve took his offered arm, her heart beginning to race not with doubt, but with anticipation. The music swelled as the church doors opened, and she caught her first glimpse of the nave filled with guests. At the altar stood Richard, tall and commanding in his formal attire, Oliver at his side as best man. As she began her walk down the aisle, Richard turned. The look on his face as he saw her, a mixture of awe, tenderness, and unmistakable love, confirmed everything she needed to know. This man, complicated and sometimes difficult as he might be, loved her truly, not as a possession or an ornament, but as the partner she was determined to be. The ceremony passed in a blur of ancient vows and timeless promises. When Richard slipped the wedding band on her finger, a circle of gold set with tiny sapphires to match her necklace, their eyes met in a moment of private connection amid the public spectacle. "With this ring I thee wed," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the church. "With my body I thee worship, and with all my worldly goods I thee endow." Traditional words, spoken by countless grooms throughout history, yet Eve felt their significance anew. This was not merely ritual but covenant, a promise between equals, despite what law and society might dictate. When the bishop pronounced them husband and wife, Richard's kiss was proper and brief as befitted the sacred setting, but his eyes promised more to come when they were truly alone. The wedding breakfast at Thornbury House was a lavish affair, with hundreds of guests offering congratulations to the new Duchess of Thornbury. Eve moved through the crowd with newfound confidence, her hand often finding Richard's as they navigated the social obligations of the day together. During a rare moment of relative privacy as they stood in a window alcove, Richard whispered, "You're magnificent, Duchess. Every man here envies me, and every woman studies you for flaws they won't find." "Such flattery, Your Grace," she replied with a small smile. "One might think you were still trying to win my favor." "Always," he said simply, the single word carrying more meaning than elaborate declarations might have. As the celebration continued, Eve noticed a late arrival, Lady Eleanor Blackwood, standing near the entrance with hesitation evident in her bearing. Richard followed her gaze, his body tensing as he spotted his aunt. "She came," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "I sent her an invitation," Eve admitted. "I thought perhaps it was time for healing to begin." He studied her face with wonder. "You continue to amaze me." "Shall we greet her together?" Eve suggested gently. After a moment's hesitation, Richard nodded. They crossed the room together, approaching Eleanor with united purpose. The older woman's expression was guarded, but lacked the hostility of their previous encounter. "Aunt Eleanor," Richard acknowledged, his tone formal, but not cold. "Thank you for coming." "I wasn't certain my presence would be welcome," she replied cautiously, "but I couldn't stay away from my only nephew's wedding, despite our differences." Eve stepped forward. "We're glad you're here, Lady Eleanor. Family should be together on such days, even when there have been misunderstandings." Eleanor's gaze moved between them, assessing. Whatever she saw in their united front seemed to soften something in her expression. "You make a striking couple," she said finally. I hope you find happiness, Richard. Charlotte would have wanted that for you, despite everything. It wasn't full reconciliation, but it was a beginning, an olive branch extended where there had been only bitterness before. Richard inclined his head in acknowledgement. Years of hurt, not erased, but perhaps beginning to heal. "Join us," he said, gesturing toward the celebration. "Meet my wife properly, without shadows between us." The remainder of the day passed in a whirl of traditional festivities. As evening approached, Eve retreated upstairs with her lady's maid to change into her travelling costume for their departure to Oakenhurst, where they would spend a brief honeymoon before embarking on a longer wedding journey to Italy. Alone in the guest chamber that had been prepared for her use, Eve found herself suddenly nervous in a way she hadn't been during the ceremony or reception. Tonight, she would truly become Richard's wife in every sense. Despite her modern education and independent spirit, this aspect of marriage remained unknown territory. A knock at the door revealed Catherine, who had come to bid her cousin farewell before the departure. "Are you terribly anxious?" she asked, sitting on the edge of the bed as Eve changed into a travelling suit of deep green wool. "A little," Eve admitted. "It's rather like standing at the edge of uncharted waters, isn't it? One can read all the maps in existence, but it's not the same as the actual voyage." Catherine laughed softly. What a very Eve way of describing it. Her expression grew more serious. "He seems a good man, despite what people whisper, the way he looks at you. It's not how most aristocratic husbands regard their wives." "No," Eve agreed, a small smile playing at her lips. "It's not." "Write to me," Catherine insisted, embracing her cousin. Not about the private aspects, of course, but about how it feels to be a duchess, to be mistress of Oakenhurst." "I will," Eve promised, returning the embrace. "And you must visit soon. The Duke has promised to host a hunting party in October. You must convince Aunt Henrietta to accept the invitation." Too soon it was time to depart. The guests lined the entrance of Thornbury House, offering good wishes and showering the newlyweds with rice and flower petals as they entered the ducal carriage. Richard handed Eve in first, then took his place beside her, raising a hand in farewell as the driver set the horses in motion. As London's streets gave way to the countryside, a comfortable silence settled between them. Richard reached for her hand, entwining their fingers in a gesture that had become familiar during their courtship. "Are you tired?" he asked, studying her face in the fading light. "It's been a long day." "A little," she admitted, "but happily so." He smiled, one of his rare, genuine smiles that transformed his severe features. "You were magnificent today. Every inch the Duchess." "I'm still learning what that means," she replied honestly. "To be your Duchess, rather than just any duke's wife. It means being precisely who you are," he said, his thumb tracing circles on her palm. "The woman who challenged me across an opera house, who demanded truth when others would accept comfortable lies, who walked into Charlotte's rooms with me and helped me face my darkest regrets." His words warmed her more than any conventional flattery could have. "I meant what I said in the church today," she told him softly. "To love, honor, and cherish. Though I may interpret honor somewhat differently than most wives." Amusement flickered in his eyes. "I expect nothing less. I didn't marry you for blind obedience, Eve. I married you for your mind as much as your heart." The journey to Oakenhurst passed quickly in conversation that ranged from plans for their Italian travels to discussions of books they both admired. By the time they arrived at the estate, evening had fully descended, the mansion's windows glowing with welcoming light against the darkness. The staff had lined up to greet their master and new mistress, offering congratulations with varying degrees of formality. Mrs. Porter presented Eve with the household keys, a symbolic gesture, recognizing her new role as mistress of Oakenhurst. "Welcome home, Your Grace," the housekeeper said with a proper curtsy. Home. The word resonated through Eve as Richard led her up the grand staircase. Not to the east wing, which remained under renovation, but to the Duke's suite in the west wing, now their shared apartments. A light supper had been laid out in the private sitting room adjoining the bedchamber. Richard dismissed the servants, insisting they would serve themselves. When the door closed behind the last footman, they were truly alone for the first time as husband and wife. "Wine?" Richard offered, moving to pour from the decanter. "Please," Eve replied, removing her travelling hat and gloves. He handed her a crystal goblet, their fingers brushing in the exchange. "To new beginnings," he said, raising his own glass. "To partnership," she countered, touching her glass to his. They sipped in companionable silence, both aware of the bedchamber beyond the half-open door, but neither rushing toward it. Richard set down his glass and moved closer, reaching to touch the sapphire necklace at her throat. "These suit you," he observed, "though not as well as your eyes suit me." Eve smiled at the unexpected poetry from her usually pragmatic husband. "You're full of surprises today, Your Grace." "Richard," he corrected, his fingers moving from the necklace to the sensitive skin of her neck. "Always Richard when we're alone." "Richard," she repeated softly, her pulse quickening at his touch. His eyes darkened as he traced the line of her jaw. "I find I'm uncharacteristically nervous," he admitted. "I want tonight to be perfect for you." The vulnerability in his confession touched her deeply. This powerful man, who commanded respect and often fear from others, was showing her a side no one else witnessed. She reached up to touch his face, drawing him closer. "It already is," she assured him, "because it's the beginning of our story together." Their first kiss as husband and wife was gentle, exploratory, so different from the brief, formal kiss in the church. His hands framed her face with surprising tenderness, and hers found their way to his shoulders, feeling the solid strength beneath his evening attire. When they finally parted, his eyes held a question. In answer, Eve took his hand and led him toward the bedchamber where their life together would truly begin. Later, as moonlight streamed through the tall windows, Eve lay in the circle of Richard's arms, her head resting on his chest where she could hear the steady rhythm of his heart. Their bodies' communion had been a revelation, not merely physical pleasure, though that had been profound, but a deeper connection that transcended words. "What are you thinking?" he murmured, his fingers tracing idle patterns on her bare shoulder. "That reality can sometimes exceed expectation," she replied honestly. His chest rumbled with quiet laughter. High praise indeed from a woman whose expectations are rarely modest. She propped herself up on one elbow to look at him, marveling at how different he appeared in this private moment. His features relaxed, hair tousled, the austere Duke transformed into simply her husband. "I was also thinking about Charlotte," she admitted softly. His body tensed slightly beneath her touch. "Why?" "Because she's part of what made you the man I married today," Eve said carefully. "The pain of losing her and your child shaped you, changed you. I wouldn't erase that history even if I could, because then you wouldn't be the Richard I've come to love." He was silent for a long moment, his hand stilling on her shoulder. "You're a remarkable woman, Eve Blackwood," he said finally, using her new married name for the first time. "As you're a remarkable man, Richard Blackwood." She settled back against his chest, feeling his arms tighten around her. "We'll make new memories here, but we needn't pretend the old ones never existed." "No," he agreed softly, "but we'll ensure they don't overshadow what we build together." As sleep began to claim her, Eve reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment, from that first challenging gaze across the opera house to the sacred vows they had exchanged mere hours ago. There would be difficulties ahead, adjustments as they learned to truly live as partners rather than merely play the roles of Duke and Duchess. But in this quiet moment of connection, she felt absolute certainty that they would face whatever came together. The weeks that followed were a time of discovery and adjustment. Their honeymoon journey through Italy provided an opportunity to know each other away from the pressures and expectations of English society. In Florence, Venice, and Rome, they were simply Richard and Eve Blackwood, husband and wife exploring ancient streets and Renaissance treasures together, falling more deeply in love, away from watchful eyes and whispering tongues. Richard revealed unexpected facets of himself, a comprehensive knowledge of Italian art, a surprising talent for languages, a dry wit that emerged more frequently as the burdens of ducal responsibility temporarily receded. Eve, in turn, blossomed in the freedom of travel, her natural curiosity and quick intelligence making her a perfect companion for museum visits and cultural exploration. Their evenings were devoted to each other, their physical connection deepening alongside their emotional one. Richard proved to be a considerate and passionate lover, attentive to Eve's pleasure and increasingly open about his own desires as their intimacy grew. On their final night in Rome, as they dined on the terrace of their hotel overlooking the ancient city, Richard raised his wineglass in a toast. "To my Duchess, who has exceeded every expectation and fulfilled hopes I didn't know I had." Eve smiled, the Italian moonlight catching the sapphires at her throat. "And to my Duke, who promised me partnership and has delivered on that promise more fully than I dared dream." His eyes held hers across the table, conveying emotions that ran deeper than words could express. "I love you, Eve, not merely as my wife or the future mother of my children, but as the remarkable woman you are." "And I love you," she replied simply, "not for your title or position, but for the man I've come to know, complex, demanding, sometimes difficult, but always genuine, always worthy." Their return to England in late October coincided with the first hints of autumn transforming Oakenhurst's gardens. The renovations of the East Wing had been completed in their absence, the spaces transformed with new furnishings, fresh wallpaper, and rearranged rooms that banished the ghosts of the past without erasing them entirely. Eve took to her role as Duchess with natural grace, winning the loyalty of the staff with her fair-minded approach and genuine interest in their well-being. She established a lending library for the servants, championed improvements to the tenant cottages, and began hosting musical evenings that brought a warmth to Oakenhurst it had lacked for many years. Richard watched his wife's transformation from Lady Aldridge to the Duchess of Thornbury with pride and occasional amazement. She had brought life back to spaces long shrouded in shadow, had charmed even the most skeptical members of county society, and had begun to heal the rift with his aunt through patient correspondence and occasional visits. Most importantly, she had become his true partner, challenging him when necessary, supporting him always, sharing both the burdens and joys of their position with equal commitment. On Christmas Eve, 6 months after their wedding, a light snow fell over Oakenhurst as they sat together in the library before a roaring fire. Eve had been unusually quiet that evening, a contemplative expression on her face as she gazed into the flames. "You're pensive tonight," Richard observed, setting aside the estate ledgers he had been reviewing. "Is something troubling you?" She looked up with a small smile. "Not troubling, no. Just significant." "Tell me," he encouraged, moving to sit beside her on the settee. Eve took his hand, placing it gently against her still flat stomach. "I believe we're to have a child, Richard, in early summer, according to my calculations." His eyes widened, a complex mixture of emotions crossing his face: joy, fear, hope, and a shadow of remembered pain. "You're certain?" "Reasonably so," she replied. "I've spoken with Dr. Bennett, who confirms my suspicions." Richard's hand trembled slightly where it rested against her abdomen. "Eve, His voice caught. She covered his hand with her own. "I know you're thinking of Charlotte and your first child," she said gently. "It's natural that you would." He nodded, emotion making speech difficult. "I want this child with all my heart," he managed finally. "But I can't help remembering, I am not Charlotte," she reminded him firmly. "My mind is sound, my body is strong, and I have a husband who sees me clearly and loves me fully." She touched his face, guiding his gaze to meet hers. "This child will be born into love, Richard, not the shadows of the past." He drew her into his arms, holding her with exquisite gentleness as though she had suddenly become fragile. "I will protect you both with everything I am," he vowed. "I know," she said simply, "and I will bring this child into the world safely, for both our sakes." As the snow fell softly outside and the fire cast its warm glow across the library, the Duke and Duchess of Thornbury held each other, no longer two wounded souls finding unexpected connection, but partners creating a future neither had dared imagine when their eyes first met across the Royal Opera House. The child growing within Eve represented more than the continuation of a ducal line. It was the physical manifestation of a love that had begun with a challenging gaze and a single silent promise, a love that had transcended society's expectations and healed wounds long thought beyond repair. In the safety of her husband's embrace, Eve thought of their extraordinary journey, from that first defiant meeting to this moment of profound joy. The Duke had claimed her with a gaze, but she had claimed him in return. Together, they had transformed claiming into belonging, possession into partnership, and the shadows of the past into the light of their shared future. June 1886 brought gentle summer breezes to Oakenhurst, stirring the curtains in the newly decorated nursery where the Duchess of Thornbury sat in a rocking chair, her infant son cradled in her arms. At 8 weeks old, James Oliver Blackwood, future Duke of Thornbury, had his father's dark hair and his mother's inquisitive gaze. Richard stood in the doorway, watching his wife and son with undisguised adoration. The fear and anxiety that had shadowed Eve's pregnancy had given way to profound joy when she had safely delivered a healthy boy after a difficult but ultimately successful labor. "He's refusing to sleep again," Eve said, looking up with a smile as she noticed her husband's presence. "I believe he's afraid he might miss something important." "Like father, like son," Richard replied, crossing the room to kneel beside the rocking chair. He touched his son's tiny hand, marveling as the perfect fingers curled reflexively around his own. Stubborn and curious, a dangerous combination he clearly inherited from his mother. Eve laughed softly. "I seem to recall a certain duke who refused to take no for an answer during our courtship. The stubbornness is definitely a joint contribution." Richard leaned in to kiss her gently. "How are you feeling today?" "Stronger," she assured him. "Dr. Bennett says I'm recovering remarkably well." The memory of Eve's difficult delivery still haunted Richard, the long hours of labor, her exhaustion, his own helplessness as he waited outside the birthing room, tormented by echoes of the past. But unlike Charlotte, Eve had emerged triumphant, presenting him with their son with weary pride, despite the ordeal she had endured. A knock at the nursery door revealed Oliver Harrington, who had become a frequent visitor and cherished friend to both Richard and Eve. "Forgive the interruption," he said, smiling at the domestic scene. "Lady Eleanor has arrived from London." "Thank you, Oliver," Richard replied. "Please tell her we'll join her in the drawing room shortly." The rapprochement between Richard and his aunt had progressed steadily over the months since the wedding. While their relationship remained somewhat formal, the bitter recriminations of the past had given way to cautious respect and, increasingly, genuine family affection. "She's brought gifts for James again, I expect," Eve said as Oliver departed. "He'll be the most pampered child in England at this rate." "He's the only grandnephew of a woman who never had children of her own," Richard pointed out, "and the first Blackwood of a new generation. Of course she dotes on him." Eve gazed down at their son, who had finally begun to drift toward sleep. "It still amazes me sometimes," she said softly, "how much has changed in a year, how much healing has occurred." Richard nodded, understanding her meaning completely. "From that first night at the opera to this moment, a journey I could never have anticipated." "No regrets?" she asked, the question light but carrying genuine weight. "None," he replied without hesitation. "Every step, every challenge brought us here." He gestured to the peaceful nursery, their sleeping son, their joined hands. "To everything I never knew I needed until you defied me with a single glance from across the opera house." Eve leaned forward to kiss him softly. "And claimed you with a single gaze from afar," she added, completing the circle of their story. As afternoon sunlight streamed through the windows of Oakenhurst, the Duke and Duchess of Thornbury sat together in perfect contentment, their son sleeping peacefully between them, living proof that even the deepest shadows can give way to light when hearts are brave enough to seek it. The end. Dear friends, we've reached the end of another story. We hope you've enjoyed every moment, whether while doing your chores or simply enjoying the audio, accompanied by a cup of warm milk or tea. We love being your daily company, your moment of relaxation, happiness, and pleasure. As always, we make it a point to gift you with timeless stories of love, companionship, and joyful moments. We love your comments. We love your presence here. Each story we share is carefully chosen with you in mind, our faithful listeners, who give us the privilege of entering your homes and hearts day after day, until our next adventure, where new characters and emotions await us. Always remember, the best stories are those that resonate in our souls and make us believe in the power of true love. With affection, your favorite storytelling company, the Legends of the Fall team. Thank you so much for joining us on this journey. We hope this story touched your heart, stirred your imagination, and brought a bit of magic to your day. Every like, comment, and subscription supports our work deeply. From the bottom of our hearts, thank you for being here. Please consider subscribing to our channel, leaving a like, and sharing this video with someone who loves a good story. Your support helps us stay motivated to continue bringing you powerful tales of love, redemption, and unexpected twists. And remember, at the end of this video, another suggested story will appear on your screen. Click it and discover even more emotional, breathtaking adventures. You just might find your next favorite story. With affection, the Legends of the Fall team.